For those of you that don't know me, my name's Martin Lill. I am the Director of International Marketing for Lakeland Industries, and this year I will have been in the business of protective clothing, especially chemical protective clothing, for 30 years. So that's 30 years involved in the design, development, the manufacture and the sale of industrial protective clothing, particularly chemical protective clothing. That's my expertise. And during the whole of that time, I've been heavily involved in getting product certified to CE standards. So I've come to know particularly the chemical protective clothing standards pretty well. And one of the things that I've noticed increasingly in the last few years is the general lack of real understanding of those standards. And it concerns me. And it concerns me because that lack of understanding, I can see, sometimes means that people think they are protected better than they really are. And that concerns me. So that's what this presentation is about. It's about how CE standards can be very commonly misunderstood. And we're going to look at three particular examples. So to start, I'm going to share my screen now. So you should then see my presentation. Here we go. Let's move that window out of the way a little. And let's start. So hopefully everyone can hear me, can see the presentation screen, avoiding the pitfalls of misunderstanding CE standards. That's what this is about. And the first question is, are standards that complex? Because one of the reasons that I think standards can be misunderstood is that they can be quite complex and quite difficult to read. Quite often they're quite scientific, and that doesn't always help in the phraseology used. But I'm going to give you an example, as much for light relief as anything else, but it's an example of a paragraph that we uncovered in the AN 943 standard for gas type protective clothing. And it's a paragraph that is essentially explaining the number of samples that should be used for the required practical performance tests. I'm going to read it out. This is the paragraph. 4 tests shall be carried out. For enhanced robustness suits, 2 sample suits shall be tested, each being tested by 2 test subjects. For regular robustness suits, 2 test subjects shall each test 2 new sample suits for 4 suits in total. Did you get that? No, me neither. I'm not going to try and sort that out now. I will say I've had quite long conversations with our CE technical manager, and we think we've sort of sorted out what they're actually telling us. But I think it's a good example of how sometimes standards are written in ways that are not as clear as they might be. That's probably an extreme example, but it is a potential explanation of why sometimes these standards are not as well as understood as we would like them to be. But the real question is, if standards are misunderstood, does it matter? Does it really matter? Because at the end of the day, the purpose of the standards is you choose a product, an item of PPE that meets a standard that is applicable to your industry. So surely, as long as the product meets that standard, then it's safe to use. That seems simple and straightforward. Unfortunately, of course, life is rarely and never as simple as that. And for all sorts of reasons, an item of PPE that's certified isn't necessarily safe for your particular application. But before we go into the meat of the presentation and look at some examples and the possible consequences of misunderstandings, because my history and my expertise is in chemical protection, I want to put it into the context of protection against chemicals, because I think it's in this sector that these sorts of misunderstandings can be particularly problematic. And I always argue that chemicals are more problematic. They are a different type of hazard than most hazards in the workplace. So why do I say that? Well, to put it into a bit of context and background, I want to talk about the reality of chemical protection and what it really means, or what it might mean. And there's a movie that's worth watching. I don't know if some of you may have seen this movie. It's called Dark Waters. It's a couple of years old now, but it has Mark Ruffalo in it, otherwise known as the Hulk, which is pretty good. And it's a good movie. It's a thriller, but it's based on a true story. It's the true story of what happened in a chemical plant in Parkersburg in West Virginia in the sort of 60s, 70s, 80s. And one of the gentlemen that worked in that plant was a chap called Ken Wamsley. Nice chap. You can find videos about Ken on the internet, about his experiences. On YouTube, you'll find some. And he's, well, as far as I know, he was still alive. He was certainly still alive a few years ago, in his 70s. But he was coping with diseases such as these as a result of coming into contact with a particular chemical in that plant. And that chemical was this: perfluorooctanoic acid. It took me a while to learn to say that, but it's otherwise known as C8 or PFOA to make it easier. And these are some of the health consequences of coming into contact with that particular chemical. Pretty nasty stuff. And I think you can see that if not life-ending, these sort of diseases from that one particular chemical are certainly life-changing. And the problem is that chemicals are a different type of hazard to most hazards. So if we take an example of you're on a building site and a brick falls on your head, if that happens, you're going to know about it, and you'll know about it immediately. Whether you're wearing a hard hat or not, if a brick falls on your head, it's going to be pretty difficult to not know that it's happened. You'll know immediately. The trouble with chemicals, they're not quite like that. Not always. Some chemicals, of course, will burn immediately, so you would know then. But with many chemicals, they're unseen. If a chemical gets on your skin, you might not even notice. And it could be happening on a daily basis, and you won't notice, because the consequences are long-term. You won't get ill that day or that week, maybe not even that month. It might be months, years, or even decades before the health consequences of your contact with that chemical emerge. And small amounts can be harmful. It depends on the chemical, but of course the extreme example of this is chemical warfare agents, where tiny volumes can kill hundreds or even thousands of people. Now, of course, most industrial chemicals are not of that order, but certainly with many industrial chemicals, quite small amounts can be harmful. Another problem with chemicals, and bearing in mind there are various figures around, but the most authoritative figure I've seen is something like over 8,000 chemicals are in use around the world in chemical plants on a daily basis, and that's increasing all the time as new chemicals are developed. And the problem is that the consequences are not always known, the health consequences. So if you look at safety data sheets for many chemicals, they will say things like may cause cancer or may damage the unborn child, and that's because we don't really know. So that is why with chemicals, chemical protection, you need to build in wide safety margins, because it may be that some of the health consequences are not known yet and may not emerge for 5-10 years in the future. So we have to be very, very careful with chemicals on that score. But on the other hand, as we saw with poor Ken Wamsley, the consequences of contamination in the long term can be catastrophic to your health. If not life-ending, then certainly life-changing. So I contend that chemicals are a different type of protection to most hazards, because you might not notice that you've been contaminated, and yet the long-term consequences might be catastrophic. And that makes them problematic. And that is why, if you read some of the content and the blogs that I write, I will stand behind my phrase that I sometimes use for chemicals, in which I describe them as hidden killers. I don't think that's an exaggeration when you take those things into account. So that's the context of chemicals. Let's look at these 3 examples that I have of where CE standards or tests are misunderstood and that those misunderstandings could have serious consequences. And the first one is the misunderstanding of type tests for chemical suits. So what is a type test? Well, if you are involved in chemical protection, any of you will know that the CE standards identify 5 different types of chemical protection: type 1, 3, 4, 5, and 6. The eagle-eyed amongst you that are still paying attention will be thinking, what happened to type 2? Good question. Well, there was a type 2, but it was removed in 2015 because essentially nobody used it largely. So 5 types of chemical protection, and each one relates to a different type or form of protection against hazardous chemicals. So type 1 is gas type protection, type 3, 4, and 6 are different types of liquid spray or splash protection, and type 5 is for hazardous dust protection, dry particles. So you've got 5 types of chemical protection, and the whole garment test is part of the testing during certification of these products, this protective clothing. And if you like, the final stage of certification and testing for these products is what is called the whole garment type test. And these are all of the same general format. Basically, a test subject wearing the suit that's being tested goes into a spray cabin for the liquid types or into a dust chamber for the dust types, and is either sprayed with a liquid or the chamber is filled with dust. We won't go into the details, but essentially from that test, you get a pass or a fail result. So you know that if you buy a type 3 chemical suit, you know that it has passed this test. That's all well and good, that's fine. Where does the misunderstanding come in? Well, unless you know the detail of that test, it's quite reasonable to assume that a pass means you're safe. A pass means there's been no penetration, so you're okay. Unfortunately, that's not what a pass means, because the reality of chemical protection with a suit like this is that it is very difficult to guarantee absolutely no penetration. So a pass in each of these tests actually allows some penetration inside the suit. Quite minimal, and it's controlled, but it does allow some penetration. So if you're assuming there's no penetration, that's wrong. And particularly if you look at the type 5 dust test for dust protection, the pass or fail criteria actually mean that in each suit, up to 15% of the dust in the surrounding atmosphere might get inside the suit. So up to 15% penetration could still be a pass. And of course, that 15%, because it's a percentage of the dust in the atmosphere around the suit, the greater the dust in the atmosphere, the greater the volume or the greater the concentration, then the bigger that number is that may get inside the suit. Does that matter? Well, this is why I put it into the context of chemical protection. Because if you think about what we've just said about chemical hazards, that they're often unseen, contamination may not be noticed, consequences are long term, that up to 15% might matter a lot. And we've got an everyday example of this, of a dry particle of dust that is just like that. Asbestos. Asbestos can be harmful in fairly small quantities if it gets in your lungs. And if it gets on your clothing because it's gone into the suit, you may inhale it later on and then you develop secondary asbestosis. So not understanding what that test really means and understanding the detail might matter a lot. So that's one example. Let's look at the second. Excuse me. This is an interesting one. This is a more topical example because it's in the medical field. It's still protective clothing. So topical right now for obvious reasons. I'll try not to use the C word, but I can't promise it won't slip out. So this is about the standard for clothing against protection against infective agents. Someone has just raised their hand to ask a question. Can I say there'll be a question answer session at the end? So ask a question at that point, and then I'll try and answer them then, rather than interrupting the session for everyone else. So this standard is about misunderstanding. This is about misunderstanding the standard for clothing for protection against infectious agents. So if you read my blogs, particularly on this subject, you will find that I quite often ask the question, do you understand EN 14126? EN 14126 is the standard that defines the requirements for clothing for protection against infectious agents, so viruses, bacteria, etc. Excuse me. So what's in that standard? Well, it's actually quite a simple standard, and it contains 4 tests. 4 tests to measure the resistance of the fabric of the garment against penetration by different forms of contaminant. So the first one, the ISO 16604, is protection against contaminated pressurized fluids. At the bottom there, we won't go through them all, but at the bottom you can see 22612 is protection against contaminated solid particles. So you've got 4 different tests that identify protection, the resistance against penetration of different types of contaminants. And the results of each are classified 1 to 6 or 1 to 3. So it seems straightforward. Where's the problem? Well, the problem comes with this. If you look at either the information provided by some manufacturers of suits or at the specifications by some users, you will find something like this. So the sharp-eyed amongst you will be immediately saying, well, I thought you said on the previous slide there was 4 tests, because there's 5 tests listed here. So are there 4 tests or are there 5 tests? Good question. What's this extra one here? ISO 16603. Well, if you remember my original list of tests, it started with 16604. So what's 16603? Let's have a look at what the standard says. This is the relevant clause in the standard, and this is the relevant text that explains. I'll not read it all out, but what that essentially says, and it says here, the synthetic blood test, ISO 16603, is used for screening purposes, i.e. to predict the level where a strike-through can be expected when performing the bacteriophage test, ISO 16604. And then underneath that, you've got the classification table, and it clearly says in the description that that classification is for according to the test 16604. So basically, the standard tells us it's pretty clear that 16603 is a precursor test. It's a test that shouldn't be quoted, and it's not there to indicate any level of protection. So why is it being used? Does it matter? Maybe those tests are equivalent. Maybe you could use either. Well, let's look back at that information. And I will say this is actually information quoted by one product on the market. I'm not going to say which one, but you can see there, it says ISO 16603, a class 3 of 6, and that's a classification. We've just seen in the standard, that classification doesn't exist, and it's a test that shouldn't be quoted. But is it equivalent? Look at the result for 16604. It's unclassified. That means it's not even class 1. The penetration has occurred at the lowest level. In this case, it's measuring the pressure at which penetration occurs. So penetration in the test that should be used is less than 1. It's immediate. So if you're thinking that those are equivalent, and you can say that 16603 implies some level of protection, according to the 16604 test, the one that should be used, it doesn't. Does it matter? We're talking about things like coronavirus. Oops, sorry, I said it. Or worse, Ebola. So I think it does matter. At least understanding that might matter very much indeed. So that's the second example. Example number 3 is the big one. This is the one I've talked about for a long time. And I would suggest that this is probably the biggest misunderstanding in P, and potentially the one with the biggest consequences. And it's fairly technical. It's not easy to understand this, so you need to put your thinking caps on. I've got mine here. I've got my Yorkshire flat cap thinking cap that I'll put on. Doesn't go very well with the headphones, but there you go. So let's have a look at this. I'll try and understand this in a way that's easy to understand. The first thing is how a chemical suit's assessed. When you're choosing a chemical suit to protect against a specific chemical, how do you assess it? How do you decide that it will protect you well? One of the very common things, the most common thing that people do, is look at a permeation test. This is a test according to test standard EN 6529. And this test looks something like this. You have a test cell. It is divided into 2 by a sample of the fabric that you are testing, the fabric from the chemical suit that is shown in the blue line on the diagram. And you introduce the chemical. Let's say the chemical for this test is methyl ethyl kill you to death. And that's introduced into one side of the cell in orange there, so that it maintains contact with the fabric. And then basically, without going into too much detail, or we'll be here all day, the equipment measures the molecules of the chemical permeating through the fabric, because permeation is a molecular level event. And what that gives you is a breakthrough, more correctly called the normalized breakthrough. And let's say, in this case, for our chemical methyl ethyl kill you to death, is 120 minutes. So that's the normalized breakthrough that gives us. So that test is measuring the resistance to permeation of a specific chemical through the suit fabric. So it seems straightforward. So the question is, how do people use that test result? How do people interpret that breakthrough of 120 minutes? Well, I have to say, I've visited chemical plants pretty much all over the world, in most places. And this is what people assume from that test result. They say, okay, the breakthrough is 120 minutes. So that means that it takes 120 minutes for the chemical to break through the fabric. Therefore, I'm safe to use the suit for up to 120 minutes. Seems straightforward, seems logical. No problem there, except there is a problem, because that is completely and utterly wrong. It is a complete misunderstanding of what that test is measuring and what it's telling you. So what is it telling you? What does that test actually measure? Well, it's measuring this. That breakthrough is actually the time until a rate or speed of permeation is reached. So if you think about measuring the movement of a car, you're not measuring when the car first starts to move, you're measuring the time until it reaches a speed of, say, 50 kilometers an hour. The time until it reaches a speed. And in this case, we're measuring the time until the speed of permeation, the rate at which the chemical is permeating through the fabric, reaches 1 microgram per centimeter squared per minute. So you're not measuring the first breakthrough. You're not measuring when the chemical first breaks through the fabric. So the question, of course, again is, does this matter? Does it make a difference? Well, to understand that, we need to clearly understand what is happening during that test over time. And the best way of understanding that is to look at a graph of permeation rate. So if we put the time in minutes along the bottom and the rate of permeation on the y-axis in micrograms per centimeter squared, our chemical, methyl ethyl kill you to death, and most chemicals will show a curve something like this sort of shape. Not always, you get quite substantial variations with some chemicals, but most will show a curve like this. So in this case, the permeation starts there at 30 minutes, and the speed of permeation increases over time until it tails off at a steady state permeation at 1.5 micrograms per centimeter squared. Now, remember we said that we measure the breakthrough in that test at the speed of 1 microgram per centimeter squared per minute, which is where we get our breakthrough of 120 minutes in this case. So everybody at the moment, most people are saying, okay, well, the breakthrough is 120 minutes, so I'm safe for 120 minutes. But look, the first breakthrough, the point where the chemical first started permeating through the fabric, was identified at 30 minutes. So between that 30-minute point and the 120-minute breakthrough, the chemical has already been permeating through the fabric at an increasing speed. And that volume, that area below the red line there, that represents the volume per centimeter squared of chemical that has already permeated at the breakthrough of 120 minutes. So that's telling us to stress chemical is already permeating through before the breakthrough, before that breakthrough identified in the test. So in answer to the question, does it matter? Again, think about that in terms of what we've said about many chemical hazards, often unseen. Contamination may not be noticed. The consequences can be long-term, but catastrophic. And that is why I think this is a major problem in the industry, because unless we know more about what is happening in that test over time with a specific chemical, many chemical plants right now could be sitting on a chemical health time bomb. Because of that misinterpretation, they think there is no contamination going on, but there could be some contamination going on. And unless they understand the detail of that test, they simply don't know. So does it matter? Well, it might do. It depends on the toxicity of the chemical. It depends how much of that chemical is needed to cause harm, and it depends on the particular parameters of what is happening in their particular application. So I started this presentation with, if standards are misunderstood, does it matter? And we've looked at 3 specific examples. We saw how the whole suit garment test is misunderstood and people assume that it means no penetration, but it might, especially with dust protection. We looked at the general misunderstanding around the EN 14126 standard for infective agent protection. And we looked at the widespread misunderstanding of the chemical permeation test and how that means that people assume that there's no contamination happening, whereas in fact, if you understand the detail, there could be some contamination occurring. Put those 3 things together with what we understand about the way chemicals work, and I think these are really critical issues. And these are just 3 examples where standards are commonly misunderstood. I could give you another 10 or 20, and in fact, we've produced 2 ebooks which are free to download that detail similar misunderstandings or myths about CE standards generally relating to chemical protection and also flame and heat protection. And I'm pretty sure that if I spoke to an expert on hard hats or an expert on respiratory protection, they will say, yeah, there's actually similar sorts of misunderstandings in my sector of the industry as well. And it's because we make assumptions about standards. So the presentation was entitled Avoiding the Pitfalls. So I guess I should give you a solution, or else I won't be doing what the title said. So what's the solution? Well, we do very much have a culture now, don't we, where everybody wants easy solutions. I wish I could give you one, but unfortunately, as with so many cases in life, there is no easy solution. There's no button you can press or switch you can flick that will solve this. A couple of things I would suggest is sign up to our Lakeland blog at the link there. I will send these links to everyone in the next couple of days. on our blog, you will find lots of articles, educational articles, which are looking at problems like this and explaining important issues that we see in chemical and flame and heat protection. And at the moment, we've got a campaign running around a 13-point checklist for chemical suit selection, management and use. So in the short time, I would recommend looking into those and signing up to our blog. But what about more generally? What can we do more generally to solve this problem where so many people are misunderstanding standards and it could have consequences? Well, it's an old saying, but it's true. The devil is in the detail. The devil is always in the detail, and we need to understand the detail. We need to read standards and understand them properly. As we saw at the beginning, they're not always easy to read and understand. I always think it's a little bit like reading Shakespeare. You have to practice. But I always recommend actually get hold of standards. They're not expensive to buy, and read them and understand them. One thing people need to recognize is that standards define minimum performance requirements. And that means that an item of PPE that is certified is not necessarily suitable for your application, because your application might need more than the minimum. So again, you'll only recognize that and understand it if you understand the detail. So don't make assumptions about standards. Don't assume that if PPE is certified, it's safe to use for you to use in your application. Again, you need to go into the detail and understand it. Find out what's in them, what's in the standards, and particularly what the tests are, how they are done, and what they're actually telling you. Because so often, as we saw with the permeation test, those tests are telling you something different from what you thought, and that might be important. Finally, enlist us, enlist our support. And I don't just mean me, I don't just mean Lakeland, but manufacturers of the products. We have, out of necessity, had to become experts in these standards in order to get products certified. So good manufacturers, we know what we're talking about. So, and we'll be happy to get involved, help train safety managers, talk to safety managers, help train users, get our support. We don't charge for it, usually. So do use us as much as you can. It's what we're here for. And really, the conclusion is become an expert. We all need to become better experts in these standards so that we can use them properly and not make assumptions about them. Because if we don't understand them properly, the danger is that the people that we are providing protection for are not as well protected as we thought, or even worse, they're not protected at all. So that concludes my presentation. I hope you found that interesting, useful. And if there's one thing I would hope that some of you go away with from this presentation, is the thought that maybe I need to read that standard. Maybe I need to understand it better. I'm going to give that Martin Lill a call and ask him to have a chat, or whoever is going to help you with that. So thank you very much. As I say, I hope it's been interesting and useful. I am now going to open the Q&A session, questions. That will be online. You can type in your questions. I will answer either online, or I may answer later with a message. The final thing I would say is do connect with me on LinkedIn. You will find lots of articles and links to other articles and our blog articles, etc. So do find me on LinkedIn. There's my address there, and I'll be very, very pleased to hear from you. So I'll open the question and answer session now. Do be gentle with me. This is the first time I've done this. So let's have a look at what we have here. I'll tell you what, I'm going to stop sharing my screen now, so you can see me rather than the presentation. So Roy, thank you for that, Roy. How can end users be assured that manufacturers and suppliers of PPE are providing quality products from educated, knowledgeable companies such as Lakeland? I suspect that's a rhetorical question from Roy, and the organisation that BSIF run, which is the just remind me of what it's called, the approved suppliers. Roy, if you could just remind me on a little message there. Yeah, this is an organisation that BSIF run, and basically you can become a member. The Registered Safety Supplier Scheme, that's the one. And that is worthwhile as a manufacturer joining, because BSIF get involved and make sure that the products that you're supplying are properly certified and meet all the requirements. So it's another level of quality assurance on top of the CE certification. Okay, let's see what else we've got. Thank you, Roy. Let's have a look. I did see a question there. Just let me also open the chat. There's some coming in on the chat rather than on the Q&A. Somebody's asked if that. Thank you for the compliment on the presentation from someone there. Yeah, there will be a recording of this presentation, and we'll send the link out to everyone in the next couple of days. So rather than me going back and explaining the EN 14126 again, we'll make sure that everyone gets a recording so they can look at that. Alternatively, if you get in touch with me through LinkedIn or through another message, I'll get back to you personally and go through it with you. That was from Thomas Vanek, by the way. Any more questions there? What if I wear two suits? Robert, I think in Poland, has asked about what if I wear two suits? It's a good question. Well, of course, if you wear two suits, you're going to be twice as uncomfortable as wearing one suit. But actually, it's an interesting question, because the natural space between two suits will provide an additional barrier for the chemical. So whilst there's not going to be any testing that would confirm that, it would, in theory, provide you with more protection, because even if the chemical comes into contact with the outer suit, the chances that it then gets into contact and maintains contact with the inner suit is probably unlikely. The problem with that is there's not going to be any way of testing to confirm it, because you're moving all the time. Yeah, I will say as well that if anyone has got, because there's quite a few questions coming in, if anyone I'll go through them afterwards, but if anyone wants to contact me directly or contact your local Lakeland representative, they'll be able to help as well. But say, don't hesitate to contact me afterwards if I miss any of the questions here, because there are a few here. Now, EN30, Vinit Singh has asked how EN 13795 standard for medical PPE is different to what was explained today. Yeah, that is a different standard, and I'll be honest, I don't know that standard well. So what I could do is look into that. I'll make a note of that, and I'll try and look into that, because I don't know how that differs, to be honest. My guess is, and something in my memory tells me that standard actually uses the same tests, or some of the same tests. So we need to look into that. Yeah, somebody's pointed out that the idea of wearing two suits would be good for sales. Yeah, double hour sales overnight. That's a good idea. I like that idea. So yeah, wear two suits, everyone. It's the only way to be safe. Yeah, somebody's pointed out about PermaSure. the problem, the misunderstanding around the permeation test is that the test is measuring a different thing to what people are thinking. People think it gives them a safe use time, which it doesn't. But there is a way to calculate safe use time, and in fact, we have a free-to-use app that you can download if you search in the App Store for Lakeland Permasure. Lakeland ChemMax. That's ChemMax. Search for Lakeland ChemMax and you should find the Permasure app. If you download that, that is an application that actually calculates safe wear times based on the toxicity of the chemical, the permeation rate, and on temperature, which affects the rate of permeation. That's a good question. There's from Rick Fessick. Is there a methodology to test product in the intended environment? Interestingly, that's not a subject I've covered today, but if you look at a blog that we'll be publishing in the next week or two, it does deal with that issue, that one of the problems with most tests is that they are conducted in a laboratory, often with the parameters strictly controlled. And that affects the permeation test, for example, because all permeation tests are done at 23, well, the fabric is pre-conditioned at 23 degrees centigrade. And we know that permeation rate is affected by temperature. So if your temperature in your application is higher than that, if you work in the Middle East or wherever and the temperature is 40 degrees, then the permeation rate will be much higher than indicated by the test. Now, tests are controlled in that way because very often the purpose of tests is to allow comparison of products and not necessarily to tell you that you were safe or not. And in broad terms, it's another example where we all need to understand the tests and what they are actually telling us rather than assuming what they're telling us. So that's a good question from Rick Fessick. But yeah, bear in mind, real world situations are often different. The parameters in the real world are often different from the parameters in which suits a PPE is tested in a laboratory. Someone's pointed out that there's questions coming in on the Q&A as well. I'm sure it's a great idea to have a chat and a QA. There you go. So Roy has said, what would you say are the key things for people to look for when selecting chemical protective clothing? Well, on the basis of the assumption that people here don't want to be here all day, because I wish it was that simple, what I would suggest in response to that is I mentioned our current campaign around our 13-point checklist, which covers chemical suit selection, management of suits, and management of suits actually in use, because one of the obvious things that people forget is you can choose the best PPE in the world, but if you're not making sure that people are using it properly at all times, then it will be undermined and they won't get the protection. And that's something we commonly see with protective clothing. During the Ebola crisis, I recall seeing pictures of people in the front line with a suit with the zip down. Well, if the zip's down, it's not protecting. The zip's there for a reason. So as well as selecting garments, you need to make sure that PPE is used properly at all times. And that's where we get into all things like training and just having processes and management systems to ensure that PPE is used properly. But in specifically answering Roy's question about what are the key things for people to look for, well, I would suggest getting hold of our 13-point checklist. As I say, I'll be sending out the links to that in the next couple of days. But also we have a guide to chemical suit selection, which covers all the key things. So I won't get into that now because we'll be here all day, but I'll make sure that that link goes out as well. Again, an anonymous attendee, that's mysterious, has said, is there a need to look at how the suit works with other products such as gloves? Absolutely. Yeah, and it's another problem often with the tests in CE standards. In reality, if you're wearing a chemical suit, you wear it with gloves, boots, face mask, or whatever, and often different variations of gloves, boots, and different variations. So that is not always how things are tested in the laboratory. There is a classic example of where two different types of suits are often used together. So you go, if people need a FR protection and chemical protection at the same time, it's quite common to wear an FR suit, an FR overall, and then put a plastic chemical suit over it. The problem is the chemical suit will ignite and burn. So in doing that, you actually destroy the effectiveness of the FR clothing. So you have to be very careful when you're wearing different types of PPE together and at the same time. Okay, there's a question from Yasemin Oymez. Could you please mention a few about remission after breakthrough, how we protect workers' skin inside the garment from heat or contamination? I'll tell you what, that's a fairly complex issue, Yasmin. So I will go through these questions afterwards, if that's okay, and I'll respond directly to you because it's a good question. I'll need to think about that one a little bit. I think there's a number of issues involved in that. And so in the interests of time, I'll come back to you directly on that. Another anonymous, what about heat stress? Are there standards that cover this for chemically protective suits? Again, it's a good question. Heat stress in all protective clothing is an issue to a greater or lesser extent. If you're talking about protection from hazardous chemicals, then obviously you can't have a suit that really breathes. So these suits are uncomfortable. The way I think to manage that, there's a number of different ways. One of them is the way that you organize work processes. So you make sure that people can take regular breaks. You make sure that people can rehydrate regularly, plenty of rehydration stations. There are also designs of suits that can improve comfort. So we have a range of chemical suits called cool suits, which actually have a breathable back. So you get the strong protection at the front in the critical part of the suit, but at the back you have a protected breathable panel which allows air to get inside and in and out of the suit, so it's a little bit more comfortable than a standard suit. It can only be used in certain situations, but what this presentation is all about is about understanding the detail. And by understanding the detail, you can often decide that you can wear something like a cool suit. You can find out about cool suits on our website, lakeland.com, or again, contact me directly and I'll send you some information on it. That's a good question. Do reusable suits follow the same standards as disposable? This is actually an interesting question. What's the difference between a reusable suit and a disposable suit? Well, the obvious thing is obviously you reuse a reusable suit, but in terms of the technical properties, what's the difference? And actually the answer is there isn't one. Of course, a suit that is described by a manufacturer as reusable will probably be heavier and tougher. But actually, if you look at the user instructions of all suits, whether they're described as reusable or disposable, you'll generally find that it says the same thing, that if the suit is contaminated with a chemical, then you shouldn't reuse it. Or if you do reuse it, you have to be sure that it's been decontaminated. And the problem with decontamination of chemicals is, remember we talked about permeation being a molecular event. With permeation, a chemical can permeate into the fabric. It can, if you like, dissolve inside the fabric and it can stay in the fabric. And even if you wash that off in a decontamination shower, that chemical may still be in the fabric. We had a case quite some time ago in the USA where a customer wanted to send back a chemical suit. He assured us that it had been decontaminated. The suit came back, it was laid out on the table overnight, and the next day the table had turned yellow because the chemical that was permeated in the fabric had actually then seeped out in the warmer temperature in the lab. So you can never be certain that you've removed chemical from the fabric. And the problem is, if you then go and reuse that suit, if the chemical is permeated in the fabric like that, it may reduce the permeation time, the time that the chemical takes to go through the suit, by quite a lot. So the protection you get the second use may be a lot less than the first use. So I hope that answered that one. Paul Jenner has asked, once we have a permeation rate of 1 microgram per centimetre squared after 120 minutes, what does this actually mean? Should the suit actually be replaced after 120 minutes? Okay, that's a good question. What we're really talking about there is identifying a safe wear time, identifying that all things being equal, and in the worst case, and remember we talked about the nature of chemicals, and I said that the nature of chemicals means we have to build in wide safety margins because we can never really be sure. What I think that 120 minutes means in practical terms is that we should never use the suit for more than 120 minutes, ideally less than that. So what it's basically allowing you, once you start to get into calculating safe wear times, or using our PermaSure app to calculate a safe wear time, is it enables us to manage the application, the situation, more effectively and more safely. So what we say is, okay, well we know we reach that rate at 120 minutes. So let's engineer the application, the situation, so a suit is never used for more than 90 minutes or 100 minutes. So we never approach that point where the safe wear time is reached. Now, that safe wear time should actually be tied in to the toxicity rate of the chemical. And actually the new standard, the 14325 standard that defines all the classifications for chemical permeation and other things, actually I identified this issue, and there's a new method of classification which relates to the specific toxicity level of the chemical. So using that, you can then identify the volume of chemical permeated through over time, and then make sure that you don't use the suits for more than that time. Now, that's a fairly complex issue, but Paul, if you want to contact me afterwards, I'll be happy to go through that with you and how that works and how you can use safe wear times to actually manage a chemical protective situation more effectively. Okay, there's still one or two questions. How would we know reusable suit needs change? So Manoj Rana has asked about how would you know when to reuse a suit or when not to? So going back to this question about reusable or disposable, my general rule of thumb here is that basically whether a suit is described as disposable or reusable, if the suit is not contaminated and if it's not damaged, there is absolutely no reason why you should not reuse it. And that's the rule. If it is contaminated, and obviously if it is damaged, don't reuse it. And remember, we talked about wide safety margins. So if you follow that rule, you should be okay. The problem might be knowing if the suit is contaminated. And this is where, again, the management of suits is not just about selecting the right suit, it's about managing them in use and having the processes and systems in use, in place, in order to manage that, so that that is monitored and that question is asked before a decision to either dispose of or reuse the suit. And in fact, if you do look at our blog, you will find a blog in there that actually specifically deals with when it is safe to reuse a suit. And as happened in the early stages of the coronavirus, of the pandemic, where people just couldn't get hold of the PPE, we did a blog which said, well, okay, if you have no choice but to reuse the suits, what are the things you need to think about in order to reduce the risk of reusing suits? So it's a good question. Is there a website to find and read the standards? No. you can certainly, we buy, I'm advertising BSIF again now. We buy standards from the BSIF site. If you remember, you get them half price. But they are available from all sorts of suppliers, but you do have to pay for them. I would be happy to send you copies out, but we'd be breaching copyright, I think, if we did that. But if you wanted to contact me directly, that's Rick Fessick. If you contact me directly, then I'll be quite happy to send you some links to where you can get them. What I won't do is send you out any free copies, because I'm not allowed to do that. Okay. Well, from what I'm seeing, I think I've maybe dealt with most of the questions. The rate of questions seems to be slowing down now. And to be quite honest, I need a drink. So I think we'll draw the seminar or webinar to a close now. Thank you very much indeed for attending. I'm just going to close that window. So thank you very much indeed for attending. I hope you found that very useful and interesting. And as I said at the end before, and I'll say it again, if people go away from this and think, you know what, I'm going to get hold of that standard, I'm going to read it, I'm going to talk to the manufacturer of the product, I'm going to actually find out that I understand it as well as I need to, because I want to make sure my workers are properly protected. So thank you very much indeed. I'm going to end the seminar now. Please do contact me on LinkedIn or any way you like, and I'll be happy to talk to you. I'll be very pleased to hear from you. So thank you again, and have a great day wherever you are in the world. Thank you.